Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Cynics. We're going to embark on a two-part series. I guess it may go to 3 parts. We'll see. But we're going to Isaac and I have both pretty extensive, a lifetime background, let's put it that way. Lifetime background in evangelicalism. And so for those of you who are not evangelicals, perhaps this will give you a little bit of more of a window as to the culture. But part of part of where we will end up with this into maybe 3 episodes is how did evangelicalism become what it is today in the 21st century? And that is I think a multifaceted issue. And so we'll try to unpack this as we go. So why don't we just start by identifying, so it's the word evangelical really originated after the Reformation with Protestants who believed, because the Protestant doctrine of you're justified by faith, not through baptism. Now, Luther still held to baptismal regeneration, but the rest of the Protestants moved away from it. And then a lot of Protestants started teaching that you had to, where you're justified by faith happens in a conversion experience. So historically, evangelical, the word evangelism just means sharing the gospel. And all Christians and even other religions, they believe in sharing the truth with others. But for evangelicals, the idea was you had to have a conversion experience or you're not a true Christian. And I don't want to get into the beliefs at this part, but that was just based on, say, Jesus telling Nicodemus, you must be born again. That's the way. And so the term born again Christian means evangelical, a person that believes you have to have some kind of a conversion experience to be a Christian. Now, culturally speaking, there were a couple different strands that really formed evangelical culture. I'm not going to go into these in detail at all, but let's just mention them. The first one was Anabaptism, the Anabaptist movement. We'll get into this also on the doctrinal side when it comes to the sacraments and baptismal, infant baptism and things like that. We can do that next episode. But for now, the Anabaptists were separationists. So the strongest Anabaptist groups really separated, like the Amish, Mennonite, Church of the Brethren, Hutterites, or Hutterites, depending on how you pronounce it. They were separatists, and that affected the broader evangelical culture. So that's the first strand of evangelical culture, is that we are different than mainstream society, or we are different from, quote unquote, the world. The world. We don't want worldliness in our culture. And so that is why these groups have always been slow to adopt whatever is popular in mainstream society, whether that's musical instruments or different forms of entertainment or technology, whatever. We have to be different. We have to have our own Christian version of everything. Okay. That's the first element. The second is mysticism. There were mystical groups that arose. First, I think through Lutherans, and then there were what were called the pietists. These are people that believe that instead of God being experienced through the sacraments, like in Catholicism, God is experienced directly, just through some magical, mystical experience. There were Catholic mystics, but there were Protestant groups, and these were just kind of isolated individuals in Catholicism. But there were entire groups of people that believed that this is like a regular thing daily. You interact with God. You, like, for example, the Quakers. You stop and listen to hear the voice of God speaking to you. That is the second pillar of evangelical culture. Okay. That we experience God directly. God tells me what to do. All right. God confirms things in my mind, whatever. Okay. And the third element of evangelical culture is populism, because evangelicalism is really the result of the full democratization of Christianity. What separates evangelicals from what we call mainline Protestant traditions in a cultural way is the way that clergy function. Evangelical groups, by and large, are controlled by lay people. Even the clergy, they don't want clergy to be overly educated, lest they lord that education over the laity. Doctrinal simplicity, or all doctrine has to be approved, like different evangelical groups, like some, like the Southern Baptist, are completely Congregationalist. Now, there were other mainline traditionally Congregationalists, and that sort of thing over and against the Presbyterians. But this idea of churches and average Christians being able to vote on what official church doctrine is, that is how evangelical thought developed. It was largely folk theology. That's next episode. But that's the second part of this. So evangelical culture, number one, again, and then we're going to kind of jump into the main figures. And Isaac, and I'll pull you in at this point. But again, the first pillar, separatism. We have to be different than everybody else. We have our own version of everything. Okay. Everything has to be interpreted through a Christian worldview. Second, mysticism. God speaks to us directly. We hear the voice of God. We feel God. We whatever. Okay. We interact with God on a personal basis. They'll even go to far as say the Christian life is a personal relationship with Jesus. Okay. And the third element is populism, that they're against hierarchicalism. They don't want there to be any kind of, like, ministers work for the people. Ministers do not have authority over the people, but even a lot of evangelical congregations view their pastors as employees, not as those who have some kind of God-given authority to make decisions that affect them. Okay. But it's kind of a weird mixture sometimes. So Isaac, would you add anything or challenge or want me to nuance anything that I've said there as kind of these three pillars?
No, not at all. I think you're spot on. I do think that when you look at those three pillars, sort of like a spectrum of other implications sort of arises that are often go unnoticed,
yes.
Which I think is probably what we're going to be talking about here
right.
for the rest of the episode. But I think those three pillars are spot on. Yeah.
Yes. All right. So let's move on to talking about the beginning of evangelicalism as we know it today. And this came as a result of what we call revivalism. Okay. Because the idea, revivalism was focused on people having these direct encounters of God, having these conversion experiences, or then later sanctification or holy baptisms experiences, or receiving the gift of tongues experiences, or receiving a call to the ministry experience, or whatever it may be. Okay. That's what revivalism was fueled by. So, in England, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. In the United States, to start with, Jonathan Edwards. Another guy that had kind of a lesser pivotal role was George Whitefield, who was a friend of the Wesleys, was a part of their Holy Club at Oxford, but he was a Calvinist. Okay. They basically, in, say, colonial era, at the time of the American War for Independence or Revolution, however we went through that in another episode.
Right, yeah.
But at this time, this is where there's a group of Protestants that are not only starting to move away from, say, like the mainline traditions and the theology that had been received like traditionally and developed even in Protestant lines through clergy and theologians, but becoming populist movements. Wesley's thing was he tried to maintain, let's talk about Wesley first. Okay. Since he's our guy. And I think he was the earlier of the three. He was probably the earliest influence. So John Wesley, his thing was he wasn't trying to start a separate movement, but reform the Church of England. Even though like he would not allow Methodism to become separate from the Church of England during his lifetime, that is in England, the colonies were a different thing because Wesley didn't support the American Revolution or American independence. He felt that the colonies ought to be loyal to the king and the crown, all that. So he did allow Methodism to organize in the United States. Now, here's the thing with Wesley. He set this up so that there was clergy control, but then there was lay participation. Like there was an opportunity for the lay people to give feedback, but they had a very limited voice. This eventually had to change over time in United Methodism in the United States. But for a long time, Methodist bishops retained the power to basically, they appointed the ministers who were going to be at each church. And churches for a long time didn't have much of a say, if any at all, over who their pastor was going to be from year to year. Okay. So Methodism is kind of this odd mixture, and it's kind of transitional in that way. But Methodism, as it was established under Wesley's watch, is pretty much what you have up and down the eastern seaboard in Methodist churches. When Methodism starts to spread across the American frontier, okay, after the Louisiana Purchase and the great push westward, that's when Methodism started to become evangelical, in terms of revivalist. Okay. And thus until this recent split, and I would say even without the split, there still is a fair amount of, diversity there in terms of worship styles, revivalism or say sacramentalism and things like that. Okay, so that's the first guy. What do you see, Isaac, as being kind of key in the role of Wesley here?
So, I think you've pretty much covered it, especially the populism part of it. I would say when we're looking at the evangelical movement as a whole and how Wesley fits into it, it is really the outside of the formal church context that Wesley sort of kicks off. Yes. The field preaching, the going into towns. And it's also, he's not as well known for this, but his social opinions end up being adopted by the later evangelical movement to the so Wesley has concern for the poor. He's basically an abolitionist.
He was.
But he is anti-systemic change. Mm-hmm. Right? And so those two things are going to be carried forward through evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. Especially when you get to like a Charles Finney. That is the opinion of the evangelical church as a whole. And the Calvinism, Arminianism debate, and basically all doctrinal debates take a sideline to the conversion experience that Wesley talks about when he talks about perfection or entire sanctification.
Right. You know, and the reason I mention these three men as pivotal is because they kind of opened the door toward a limited amount of populism. Okay, so Wesley, you had the control of the church hierarchy, but yet there were what he called class and band meetings where people were put into small accountability groups, and lay people were trained to lead these groups. And then Methodists even trained and licensed lay people to go speak in other churches. And Wesley, as the Methodists started to move into the colonies in the United States, and later United States, then it helped them to, like, in other words, they had to ordain ministers who could not get the regular level of education that was needed for ordination in the Church of England originally.
Right.
And so he made these kind of changes. And like you said, now the other things, preaching in the fields and that sort of thing, some of that he was forced to do, but it became more of an accepted thing that people's out there preaching in the fields, preaching on the streets, etc. One time Wesley even preached a sermon standing on his father's grave. So anyway.
Well, and I think the type of conversion experience that Wesley talks about, with like the warming of the heart and this like hyper personal mysticism, is sort of a innovation in the mystical theology of the time. That if you look at like the Catholic mystics, yeah, they have this like personal thing, but it's not the like very intimate relationship that Wesley talks about.
Right. He got that, from the Moravians that he interacted with, and he was convinced that these people kind of had like knew God's frequency, so to speak, and were picking up God's signals.
Right.
If you can say
and then if you look at like the American revivalist movement, the Great Awakening, and like the birth of even the Mormon Church, if you didn't have some like crazy mystical experience in the woods in upstate New York, you were basically nobody. God had to have talked to you somewhere in upstate New York, basically, for some reason, in order for you to be legitimate.
Right. No, and this was, a new wave of so-called prophets.
Exactly.
That start in Christianity. So yes. So Wesley was pivotal in that way. Jonathan Edwards, not so much in the same ways, but his, sinners in the hands of an angry God and that sort of thing. It was more that with
charisma.
With the success of that, there was more openness to giving the people sermons that they could more identify with. In other words, adapting little by little small pieces of the worship service that in order to appeal and be able to connect with the lay people, rather than, for many years it was, okay, this is what the church does and this is what it is. So you come in and you go through the learning curve and then you'll know what's going on. Now it was more like, oh no, we're going to bring in people. They may know very little about this, but we're going to break it down. We're going to put it in terms they can understand. And so everything is becoming more, let's say, consumer based, if we want to say it that way. And that go ahead.
Edwards and Finney are both Calvinists, right?
Yes.
So they're preaching, like, especially sinners in the hands of an angry God. I think they are breaking from church tradition in preaching that way, because you're not really supposed to try to convert people if they're not part of the already elect, the predestined.
Right.
So there's a rebellion against predestination in Finney and Edwards.
And Edwards is really pivotal in basically developing Calvinism along Arminian lines, little by little.
Yeah.
Even though he was not an Arminian, this idea
technically neither is Finney, even though basically preaching Arminian theology.
Yes. I think. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I thought that Finney did identify. He was Presbyterian, but I think he embraced Arminianism to a great extent.
Most people would say that, but he never clarified his doctrinal position.
No. It was ambiguous, but Yeah, his arguments, it's been a long time since I've looked at that material. But yeah, so Finney, the idea here is that little by little, everything is starting to shift rather than people have to adjust to the way the church does things. It was the evangelical culture is about, we're going to do what appeals to the average person. So it's really being driven by what the average person wants and can relate to. And so it's very consumer driven.
Well, and the other aspect of it that I think is unique is that it places ethics in the hands of the people.
Yes.
Which Calvinism beforehand had not done, right? Because it's all predestined.
Well, and this is facilitated. I don't want to I'll just kind of state this and move on. But this is what gets facilitated by the mysticism. Because after all, if God speaks to us, well, then the Holy Spirit is going to speak through our conscience. And thus, you don't need a whole bunch of training or education to know right from wrong, because the Holy Spirit will tell us whenever something's wrong. See, we'll come back to that next week. But I think that is a very important shift away from scholarship and education to just simple folk theology.
Right. So like later on with people like Donald Dayton, who wrote Rediscovering an Evangelical Heritage.
Right.
He argues that like these early evangelicals place social justice sort of at the center of this movement.
Right.
And that the proper way to understand the evangelical movement is as a socially progressive one.
Right.
I'm not convinced by that argument, but I do want to talk about why those early evangelicals were so concerned about social justice.
Yes. Before you do that, go ahead. Let's just do
just because
first.
it'll become really important when we get to the post-Civil War era. But go ahead.
No. I was going to make a broader statement that a lot of groups that are formed early in their history, they are countercultural. They tend to be reformationist in the sense that they want to reform or change something, because otherwise they would still be a part of their original groups.
Right.
Okay. So anytime a new movement springs up, it's a new movement that arises where people are doing something that isn't being done somewhere else, or they're saying things that aren't being said anywhere else. I think Dayton is right that the early evangelicals, and including maybe especially the holiness people, were socially progressive in their day and age. But just because a group starts out socially progressive doesn't mean that they remain that way over time.
Yeah. So part of what I'm going to argue as we trace this background is how we became non-socially progressive, and why that it is a logical conclusion to draw out of the foundations of the evangelical movement.
Right.
But the early evangelists, so Charles Finney, his revivals were co-ed, which was sort of a revolutionary thing, and mixed race.
Yes.
Which was also pretty revolutionary in his day and age.
Well, George Whitefield did encourage slaves to come to his services, because the slaves are much more receptive and responsive. And Whitefield liked that. Whitefield was the guy who, even though he still preached in a robe, he was very dramatic. He would raise his voice and gesticulate and walk around, and all that stuff was unheard of. That was considered to be, really racy or whatever, oh my, this is so risque, the pastor walking around preaching. But yes, people responding and saying amen and things like that. That's a part of it. And so these groups were very much for racial integration, because the black people, the slaves, and then later former slaves who came to these meetings brought a different cultural element that was missing in white America that these white folks enjoyed too. And initially, there was integration that went on, but not everybody went for that. And so you still ended up like with the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. So, not all the Methodists wanted to have black people attending their church. So let's give the black people their own church. So there was some of that too. So maybe, I think Dayton is right. I don't want to jump ahead of what you're doing here. I think Dayton is right. There were these progressive elements. Now, how widespread that progressive feeling was, I'm not sure.
Well, I think I don't disagree with Dayton that the early evangelists were progressive. They certainly were.
Well, yes,
Oberlin
yes.
College and Wheaton College were both
Right.
foundational for the abolitionist movement.
Right.
What they weren't is radical at their core.
Right.
Right. And that's part of what I think is the reason for the regressive nature of evangelical culture today.
Explain that.
So the social justice of the early evangelicals followed from the conversionist model of their theology. So the order, like even Charles Finney talks about like, the way that you get abolition in America is not by, he's not a John Brown, let's go start a revolution and free the slaves now. Let's win over the hearts of the slave owners. Let's convert the slave owners, and then they'll just give up their slaves freely.
Right.
And that becomes the MO, the modus operandi of the entire movement.
Yeah. Except that, that didn't always happen. That was what, that's what led to the formation of the Wesleyan Methodist Connection by Orange Scott, Seth Reese, I think it was. Anyway, yeah, there was a Methodist bishop in I think North Carolina who married a widow who owned slaves. And after they got married, they retained the slaves. And so the Wesleyan Methodists up in Michigan, they formed they seceded from the Methodist Episcopal Church and protested that because this bishop, would not get rid of those slaves. And so anyway, and that's interesting. I'm curious here. So it's kind of hard to say, because neither one of us are specifically focused on this period of time to be able to answer a really deep, detailed question here. But I'm wondering, okay, so there were the people who continued to justify owning slaves theologically by saying, well, Paul doesn't say that slavery is wrong. He just says, be nice to your slaves. So as long as we're being nice to our slaves, we're obeying scripture. And, they even claim this whole thing where everybody's got a place in the pecking order, and the dark-skinned people were cursed by Noah, way back, so anyway, the children of Ham or whatever. And then, so I'm wondering what the difference is here between the people who are progressive versus the people who, are okay and defend the status quo.
Yeah.
I don't want to get in too deep too quickly here. So if we want to just kind of put this on the back burner for a second, let it simmer, come back to it, we can do that.
No, I think there's a kind of a simple answer to it, is that the doctrine of total depravity is what sort of drives Finney to say it doesn't matter if you're a man, woman, or white or black. Everyone is the same because everybody's totally depraved.
Okay.
So there's an egalitarian nature to total depravity that Finney taps into.
Okay.
But that same doctrine is used to say there's nothing, on the more Lutheran side, there's nothing we can do to affect our salvation. And that is held in like there is neither there's no solution to this in evangelicalism. It's not, because evangelicalism isn't focused on developing doctrine in its early stages.
Yes.
So I think just a lot of the like slave-holding evangelicals took the position of, well, I have faith that Jesus will save me regardless of this.
Yeah. Now here's something that we haven't really. In fact, it didn't really enter my mind until just now, but I think this is another important factor. The reason I think that evangelicals early on were more socially progressive in terms of, say, slavery is because it was a populist movement. And these people, there were hardly any of them that could afford to own slaves to begin with.
Yep.
So who are the people that resist? The people that resist are those that have some kind of a stake in keeping it the same.
Well, and evangelicalism is a pretty northern movement, right?
Yes.
It is centered in New York.
Right. And that would be another topic to explore. I've seen other people try to somehow put the American South into as part of the Bible Belt, but that's not really accurate. The Bible Belt is just this revivalism that sweeps across the central frontier as it's being settled.
Right.
Because these folks are getting their Christianity in little country churches, like they're just establishing small towns, and then later it's decades before you get some big cities develop. And even then, big cities were kind of few and far, like they weren't mega cities like we would have today.
Well, there's another social dynamic that we haven't talked about, which is the church back in those days was actually state supported through taxes. This is something not many people know, that the American government funded its religion, even though it had separation of church and state. It saw that religion was part of the well-being of all society and therefore gave a portion of taxes to churches.
All right. So what time period are we talking about here?
The early, like from the Articles of Confederation up until like the 1870s.
Okay.
I think is like the last kibosh on that sort of thing. But the evangelical churches are not state supported. And so when you're moving across the frontier and there basically isn't government, the people who are sending ministers out there are the evangelical missionaries.
Yes. I fear that you are, I know this isn't your intent, but I fear that, that you're helping to make the case for the Christian nationalists.
Am I?
Well, after all, I mean, usually the secularists are citing like the Treaty of Tripoli and other early documents and saying, no, the United States is not founded on the Christian religion whatsoever, yada, yada, yada. There should be a wall of separation. But if the government is actually funding churches, does that not lend itself to the narrative that the United States was a Christian nation until the 1870s?
Yeah, so this was not a United States across the board thing. This was up to state governments.
Okay.
And certain states...
That's important to note.
Yes, certain states voted not to ever support the church through taxes.
Okay.
Certain states did.
So this was not something that was federally done. This was something that...
It was ended by the federal government.
This was something that the federal government permitted states to do until the 1870s. And then the federal government
And that might even be late. It might have been up until like the 1830s that the last one was... It was some famous Supreme Court case way back in the day. Yeah. I don't have the exact date, but it was early. I have to look
that up. Okay.
And like Thomas Jefferson famously hated this.
Yes.
He wrote about it pretty extensively. Like, this should never be the case. And the Constitution gives the federal government the right to put an end to this, but they didn't. And so it wasn't long, but it was up through the era of the Great Awakening that this was going on.
All right. So we were talking about Finney and populism. All right, we're talking about to what extent early evangelicals were or were not, say, socially progressive in terms of race. Race was the issue in slavery, but namely slavery through the issue of race.
Well, and also feminism and stuff like that.
Yeah, because, and I'll guarantee it wasn't like, okay, when we say, oh, it was over slavery. Well, no, it was over race, whether certain races can be enslaved. Because I don't know of anybody who had indentured servants from the same race. There weren't white people who had white slaves. These slaves were all black. And so it really was over race. Not so much slavery, because it wasn't like slavery was applied across the board. It was just inflicted on one race of people. So anyway, all right. So let's talk about how then evangelicalism unfolded. So let's talk about here in the 1800s, how these three pillars kind of worked themselves out. Okay, so we had separatism, mysticism, and populism. So what would you consider to be the next significant development, or do you just see this as kind of a gradual?
So I think post Civil War, the evangelical church is sort of like trying to find its footing without the abolitionist movement to unite it, right? And I think this is how you get things like the Church of the Nazarene and the other holiness, the Pentecostals. This is where they come from, is this sort of like splintering of the evangelical movement into denominations focused on specific social issues. Right. So the Church of the Nazarene is focused on urbanization and poverty.
Right. And that's another thing too. So anytime you have like some kind of reform movement, and yes, like the Wesleyan Methodist and the Free Methodist were both abolitionist groups, but I don't think everybody who joined them was necessarily that gung-ho about abolition, the abolition of slavery. I'm sure that the majority were. That does seem to be pretty evident. But it's just like the Protestant Reformation. You had other people jump on the bandwagon who didn't really care about the particular, like the practice of indulgences or whatever. They really didn't care much about that. They had other motivations for wanting to basically bust up the monopoly of the Catholic Church.
Right.
And I think the same thing happens with all movements. So what I want to say is I kind of get the sense, I think, I'm not sure. Let me say it that way. I'm not sure. For example, I don't think the evangelical groups were opposed to racial equality. I'm not sure, though, how many of them actually supported or were for racial equality, because remember, even after the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth, and all of that, you still had a lot.
Happy Juneteenth, by the way. This comes out on Juneteenth.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that something? So it's a good theme. And we didn't plan it that way, but so it must have been divinely decreed that we would take this on. But I guess what I want to say is I think probably most of the people in these groups of evangelicals, it probably didn't really affect them that much in their personal lives. Because there was a lot of racial segregation. It wasn't as though, now people who lived in the cities, I'm sure now they came face to face with former slaves who had migrated north looking for work and such. But most people, so this is the thing. Evangelicalism, little by little becomes predominantly rural over time. Finney, in the early 1800s, 19th century, his crusades, his revivals were held in the big cities. That's what separated him from a lot of the other evangelists of his day. And then this really wasn't picked up until time like Billy Sunday at the turn of the 20th century and D.L. Moody. Mm-hmm. But so I guess what I want to say is, for me, I don't know even there's nothing to suggest that evangelicals were secretly, still supporting slavery as an institution or anything like that. So I think they were okay and favored freeing the slaves and giving people their freedom. I don't know though that would necessarily equate to, well, I'd be happy to have them attend my church, because a lot of these folks lived in parts of the country that were more rural, and these places were all segregated. Even the big cities tend to segregate into like small neighborhoods. That's why how many cities in the United States have a Chinatown, for example?
Right, yeah.
Because nobody wanted to live next door to the Chinese people. So we just keep them in one little neighborhood, and then we'll just kind of walk in there when we want to eat some egg rolls or something, and then we leave them alone and go do our own thing again. But that's kind of the way this country was for the longest period of time. And I think a lot of the world was that way too.
It's a bit telling that like post-war, the evangelicals aren't like going, like protesting Jim Crow laws. The evangelicals aren't protesting segregation.
Right.
Like even into the civil rights movement into the 60s, the evangelicals just kind of stay out of it.
Yes. Now, and that's kind of the
black
point.
Evangelicals do not stay out of it. But
No.
they're sort of a separate movement at that point.
That's because they have a personal stake in it.
Right.
All right. And that is exactly the difference. There is a strong difference between white evangelicals and all other evangelicals in the United States, mainly black and Hispanic evangelicals. Because black and Hispanic evangelicals can more identify with what it means to be a marginalized group in society. Whereas white people, I don't want to get into a bunch of white privilege stuff, but again, if it doesn't affect you, okay, and that's why, okay, and I'm getting ahead, but just kind of looking forward here, LGBTQ becomes a big issue because it's something that's going to affect everybody at some point.
Well, so I think that is the LGBTQ issue is also sort of tied into the same issues that organized the moral majority movement.
Yes.
Of like abortion and divorce, that the evangelical movement sees abortion, divorce, and LGBTQ as one issue.
Yeah.
And that issue is the family.
Well, the big, in my lifetime, okay, and I was just a kid when this happened, but looking back, you can see all this stuff started brewing at this period of time. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe we won't need the third episode, but maybe. So how does evangelical, and we haven't even talked about evolution and all that sort of thing, and we can come and maybe we'll just keep going with the way we're going here. Roe v. Wade, and that's why that has been considered to be a landmark thing. We've got to overturn Roe v. Wade. And hear me out. And I know, listen, I've been a part of Right to Life. I'm not a big supporter of abortion, but I am not for, let's put it this way. At the very earliest stages of pregnancy, when it comes to the health of the mother and congenital problems and other concerns, is a zygote person, that to me is a nebulous question. Again, how do you even religious people can't agree on this. So like Islam has a thing like where the soul doesn't enter into the fetus until 40 days or something like that. So in the first 40 days, an abortion is acceptable because the fetus doesn't have a soul yet. Okay, so this, it's not necessarily a religious principle that everybody has a soul at conception or whatever. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here, yes, it was about abortion, but it was more than that. The Roe v. Wade decision was the beginning of evangelicals no longer controlling mainstream society. That's my personal take. That's why for them, overturning that is very symbolic for them. It's not just because I'll guarantee you there are even people among them that if their 16-year-old daughter got pregnant, they would rush her in for a D&C or have an early abortion if they had to and not tell anybody. There are some who would go ahead and have the baby and help raise it, and I applaud them. I don't like to see pregnancies terminated, okay? Especially as it becomes a fetus and starts to develop. I don't like that, but again, you have to make societal issues based on science and practical considerations, not on a bunch of religious assumptions. Okay.
Well, I think the abortion issue is a bit of a touchstone, and I want to talk about the forgotten history of evangelicalism during the labor movement and during the Great Depression.
Abortion, I am talking about labor movement. Different type of labor, but go ahead.
Well, I think because the rationale behind the evangelical movement becoming conservative is found in that time period.
Yes.
So, right. So post Civil War, the evangelical movement takes up all these other different social issues as sort of like the call to righteousness. So for the Church of the Nazarene, it's poverty and urbanization that they're trying to address. But there are now secular movements that are also addressing this,
right?
Particularly the labor movement with the International Workers of the World,
right?
And the evangelical movement, for the first time, so during the abolition movement, they're kind of seen as heroes on the Underground Railroad. They're participating in the social progressive movement of their era. But during the labor movement, they're seen as the villains. So even the Salvation Army is railed against by the IWW because they're against labor organization, because of the same reason that they are concerned at all about poverty.
Right.
Because it's about the soul, it's about the conversion experience of individuals. And if individuals are forced to behave, right? If CEOs are forced to pay a fair wage, then they'll never have the opportunity to save that soul. Right?
Right.
And it's now the government forcing people to be ethical instead of, the rational argument that Christ shows us the way to do this correctly.
But that's part of the separatism.
Exactly.
That's all. Yeah. So that's part of the separatism. They want to convince themselves that they are the only people who really know what it means to be moral, and that they're the only people that are properly motivated to be moral. So even if we say, well, hey, people don't like to live in a society where you get killed. Well, self-interest, enlightened self-interest, that's not really ethics. I mean, they want this separatism ends up morphing into, so say like the early separatist groups, even tradition. So like Amish, Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, they tend to be very humble, and we stick by our convictions, but we don't judge other people. We'll leave that to God. By the time this plays out into mainstream evangelicalism, it's not being played out with that kind of humility anymore. It's this somehow that they are now the self-appointed moral conscience for the entire nation because we're the only ones. We're the only ones who are real Christians. We're the only ones who understand right from wrong. We're the only
and they're
ones.
also the only ones who can address these social issues.
Yes. Right. Because, well, yeah, the people of the world, they'll have their solutions, but they always fall short.
Right. So I don't know if you know who Joe Hill is.
No.
He's a wobbly. This is a weird labor movement term, but a wobbly is somebody who like sings songs to recruit. They're agitators for the labor movement.
Okay.
So he writes music to the tune of hymns.
Okay.
And turns them into labor movement songs.
To antagonize people?
So what they would do is he would set up a labor movement band on the opposite street corner as a Salvation Army band.
Oh my golly.
And sing the same hymns.
Oh my.
But with different lyrics. So sort of the reverse version of a Charles Wesley, turning the bar songs into hymns. He's turning the hymns into labor movement songs. But he wrote a song called The Preacher and the Slave to the tune of, On the Sweet By and By. And the second verse and chorus go, the Starvation Army, they play, they sing and they clap and they pray till they get all your coin on the drum. Then they tell you when you're on the bum, you will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. And that's where the phrase pie in the sky comes from.
How long ago was this?
This was 1911.
No, I had not heard that before.
Yeah, so that's the origin of the phrase pie in the sky.
I see.
And that, I think, that song exists and became sort of ubiquitous throughout our culture, shows the position of the evangelical church.
Yes. Yes.
In that time period. That they are, they're doing great things. They're giving food to the poor, they're, trying to help them by educating them and getting them off of alcohol. That was like a big deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially for the Nazarenes in the Salvation Army and those who were involved in the inner city.
Yeah.
Was promoting abstinence from alcohol and really supporting prohibition on a political level.
Yes. Okay. So,
but they're seen as the villain by the labor movement, who's like, okay, well, that's great that you want to save our souls, but we need something to eat. We need fair wages. We need. The end of this song is, you will eat by and by when you've learned how to cook and to fry. That's what the unions are talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is radical, and the evangelical church can't be radical because of its conversionist theology.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I'd like to come back to Roe v. Wade, if I may.
Can I get you
finish
there?
your thought, because this Roe v. Wade thing for me is kind of an epiphany I've had here during this discussion.
The evangelical church sort of fell out of favor in the Civil War to World War II era. They declined in popularity,
right?
Especially after the Scopes trial. And I think that was the turning point where the evangelical sort of MO became reactionary. That the non-doctrinal sort of theology of the evangelical movement was traded for the Princeton theology of fundamentalism.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think the rejection by mainstream society, especially throughout the Great Depression, is what radicalized the reactionary nature of evangelicalism.
Yeah, if I may, if you're okay with this, I would like to defer the discussion of evolution in the Scopes trial for tomorrow when we get into beliefs. It has cultural ramifications. It does, but this is where the intellectual side really ends up having cultural ramifications as well.
Yes.
If you're okay with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on it as like how did we go from abolitionists to where we are now? To get you to this issue.
So let's do that instead of jumping all the way to Roe v. Wade. Okay, so you had this populist movement. the thing was intellectually what was happening in the late 1800s. That was a lot more than people could handle. And the first reaction to it, I'll just say this without getting into the details, but the first reaction to it was from from traditional Calvinism, from the Presbyterians, from the Princeton Presbyterians. At the time of Finney was considered one of what they called the New Light Calvinists. There was a movement in the early 1800s amongst the Presbyterians, and the Presbyterians split. Today you have the Presbyterian Church of America and the Presbyterian Church USA. Okay? One is conservative, and the other is liberal. I think it's the Presbyterian Church of America that's the main group that is more liberal. But the Presbyterian Church, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's the way it is, Presbyterian Church USA was the break-off group that maintained the traditional beliefs. It was over adherence to the Westminster Confession, which was a 1600s statement of Calvinism, talking about how even babies that die are predestined to either heaven or hell and different things like that. And Charles Finney, even the beginning of his systematic theology, goes on this big rant about how all these Presbyterians who continue to hang on to the Westminster Confession have turned it into what he calls a paper pope. And so Lyman Beecher was another guy who was a part of this New Light Presbyterian movement. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mm-hmm. All right. But these New Light Presbyterians broke away, or basically started, they split with the conservatives. All right. Princeton was on the conservative side, but then Princeton eventually repositioned itself in the early 1900s, and then eventually moved toward the progressive side. And then a group of faculty left there and went and founded Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Okay. Or J. Graham Meacham and right. Cornelius Van Til and some of those people were at. And that became kind of the backbone of the conservative, the fundamentalist Presbyterians. Okay. So fundamentalism. There's this divide. And so these end up becoming the two strands. Like basically 1800s, you just have this populist movement. Okay. But by the end of the 1800s, because of social and intellectual developments that happened, it basically kind of separated evangelicals into two main camps, fundamentalists and what I would call Pentecostal / charismatics. Like, in other words, you have some evangelicals who were all about doctrine and the inerrancy of the Bible, and you've got to believe A through Z to be a Christian. The other side, it was more, no, we just are more tolerant. We accept different positions, but we know we're right with God because we experience God directly. And as long as you're still feeling the presence of the Holy Spirit in some way, you know you're right with God. And so they weren't hung up on everybody having to believe the same thing. Now, that's kind of the way they went. And there's still some overlap and back and forth, but you had these kind of two parallel parts of evangelicalism that kind of kept. And you had then, after the Scopes trial, kind of a third group that kind of emerged who weren't really charismatic leaning, okay, or Pentecostal leaning, but they were not going to go to the point of trying to oppose science like the anti-evolutionists were and still are. So there was a whole strand of those folks that started calling themselves evangelicals because they did not want to be labeled as fundamentalists. This all got kind of put on hold during the Depression and World War II. Everything starts on a good note in the 1950s. Everybody's, all the soldiers have returned back from the war. We have a big baby boom. Everybody's going to church. Even like you had the advent of television, radio was bigger than it ever had been. You even had like Catholic Cardinal Bishop Fulton Sheen had his own radio show. You also had Billy Graham, who was doing big crusades, and they were being televised. And so there was all this kind of good feeling, and everything was moving in this direction. And then the 1960s happened. You have all this cultural unrest, but even amongst the hippie movement, this was kind of the hippies wanted to kind of do a get back to Jesus movement and get away from some of the cultural baggage that had started to develop with this kind of, let's say here, kind of middle America status quo that you get during the Eisenhower years in the post-World War II era. And basically because this was largely a white evangelical type narrative that was dominating the country at this point, post-World War II. Late 40s throughout the 1950s. In the 60s, this is where the hippies, then the civil rights movement, you had the ERA movement for women, basically people pushing back and saying, okay, maybe everything's nice for all you middle-class white folks, and we had a big, strong middle class, okay? Largely due to labor unions, which the evangelicals a lot were supportive of, even if, regardless of their political party.
Sure. So can I add a little bit of historical
please
nuance to this?
Yes.
So one of the things that is going on economically is the Great Depression is attempting to be fixed by the New Deal pre-World War II. And part of the way FDR got that done was by partnering with big business.
Right.
This is not a narrative that is like normally talked about with FDR, that FDR was like the big friend of big business, of these big CEOs. He really wasn't. But part of how he got his agenda through the government was by permanently limiting the power of unions to negotiate on behalf of employees.
Right.
So basically the government regulates now how unions can negotiate contracts and do strikes and stuff. So
Right.
there are no more general strikes. There's no more, all of that's considered illegal.
Right.
Because of FDR.
Well,
And
yeah.
a lot of economists today would say, well, the New Deal maybe was a Band-Aid on the scenario, because the scenario was that the general American public didn't have enough money
Right.
to pay for things. And because of that, the demand for products disappeared, which is what caused the Great Depression in the first place.
Right.
But that World War II really fixes the economy by giving us a military economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that military economy, the strategy post-World War II is to permanently create a military economy, so that the military economy basically is the U.S. economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that military economy can never go away, or we return straight back to the Great Depression scenario.
Yeah. That's that is the narrative. That is yes. That's good. That's a good point to make.
That's why there's such a budget for the U.S. military, and that's why almost every American company is in some way related to the military-industrial complex.
Right. Yeah.
Part of the like where evangelicals find themselves in that is that the resistance to the military-industrial complex is also tied into undermining the nuclear family, which is sort of the like, if you read functionalist interpretations of America, the nuclear family is like the building block of all social stability.
Right.
And that when the labor unions and the progressives are characterized as like socialists, communists, and that those things carry with them an anti-Christian context, the evangelicals sort of find their enemy, their niche in resisting that, and because there's a lot of power involved in supporting the nuclear family as the basis for the way the American economy works, they find some powerful friends in American politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I'm not disputing any of that. I think this goes hand in hand with it, because how we got to here from there largely has to do with that. Actually, yeah, Roe v. Wade was another thing, but probably
I think that's my leaving you at the doorstep of Roe v. Wade.
Yes. Although now that you're mentioning this, it's making me think that probably the 1960s and all these liberation and equality movements and rights movements was really the beginning of the turnaround for evangelicals. And the reason I say that is
I wholeheartedly agree.
Evangelicals were, again, largely white, but also a lot of black evangelicals, okay? Hispanics, traditionally, coming into this country, came in because of coming from Central and South America, which had Catholicism forced on the indigenous peoples by the conquistadors. And so they largely coming in were Catholic. But now you have a lot of even Hispanic people who are joining the evangelical ranks, either, on the charismatic side or on the fundamentalist side, whatever. The charismatic side, to the extent that people enjoy like emotional expression and that sort of thing, or to what extent people value somebody defending traditional values, the nuclear family, et cetera, et cetera. That's the other appeal to it. Now, this is the thing, though. The white evangelicals. So let's just kind of talk about white evangelicals from this point forward, because I don't know.
I think it is pretty defensible to say that black evangelicals are a separate movement.
And they're not affected in the same way. Like the issues that are coming or that are here right now, the cultural divide is with white evangelicals. I mean, the statistics show that. So let's talk about that. And I'm not doing this to ignore black and Hispanic evangelicals, but the cultural tension between mainstream American society is with white evangelicals in particular. This is like the strongest core of Trump supporters, and that's why Trump is pandering to them. If Trump didn't have their support, he would have never been able to get his campaign off the ground. Okay? So it was important for him to understand, and this is what's kind of interesting about Trump, is because he's shrewd. So he isn't actually stupid, but the problem is he's so arrogant and egocentric that he just constantly is blowing smoke and bragging, and then he says stupid things. He just says things without thinking. But in terms of reading a situation and how to influence people, he's very shrewd, and he knows what he's doing, and he's very intentional. So here's the way I see it. Okay. So, and we can debate this or you can applaud me, whatever. We haven't discussed this ahead of time, folks. So this is just my opinion. And Isaac can react to it however he wants. But my reading on is this. See, white evangelicalism, they felt like this is our country. It's God's country. God bless America. God chose America. God, we're the city on a hill, and all this other stuff. See, that was all reinforced while all these minority groups were repressed in society. As long as all these other minority groups were repressed, then they basically were in the driver's seat, because amongst the white people, they were the largest consolidated group. Okay. Once society began to decide that, hey, yes, we have been fair, and in some ways we were forced to decide that. Black people got tired of waiting around for white people to do the right thing. And so some of them did what they felt like they had to do. Okay. Right or wrong. But we came to this point where we're like, okay, so what happens here after the 60s? You have these, civil rights legislation, you have voting rights legislation, you have Title IX, you have, all these changes. Now, evangelicals have largely believed, and they didn't have to get involved with anything else. We can just stick with our preaching and our worship, and we can influence hearts and win people one by one. They didn't have to worry about society because they basically were in the driver's seat. Okay. But when all of these other groups started to become more and more empowered, you started hearing multiple voices, and people started to let's put it, little by little, people started buying into the evangelical narrative of life, the United States, all of this, religion, and they started buying into it less and less. I think then you had all these things come down the pike, and I really do think that Roe v. Wade was kind of like a dagger, because that was the one where, again, what motivated people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson was, and Pat Robertson even said this right on the 800 Club. In other words, we can keep having revivals and doing everything we want to do, but the truth of the matter is, Supreme Court has absolutely unchecked power, and the Supreme Court has more power than any other body in this country. So if we are to get our nation back, we have to have control of the Supreme Court. That's what it's always been about. Now, the homage to Reagan was the same thing as Trump. Give us Supreme Court justices. Give us Supreme Court justices. Ones that will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. That was the litmus test, and has been the litmus test ever since it was passed. Ever since the Roe v. Wade ruling, the litmus test for every Supreme Court confirmation, like that was one of the main questions that was asked. Where do you stand on Roe v. Wade? Will you uphold it as precedent or not? This has been the litmus test ever since. That's how, before that, the main litmus test for evangelicals was, do you believe in evolution? And that still is there too. We'll talk about that one tomorrow. But so here we go. The intellectual test for a lot of evangelicals is, do you accept evolution? Or they said has been the case. Now, whether they're kind of sliding, I don't think they've given up on that one, but they're not emphasizing that one because the cultural one is the more important one to them, which is, and they feel like they've got the moral high ground for that, because after all, abortion isn't like something that we all go out and praise. We just want it to be legal, okay, when it's needed. But I don't know that hopefully nobody's out there. Yeah, let's kill as many fetuses as possible. It's not a good thing, but sometimes it's maybe a necessary thing. And so they feel like they've got the moral high ground on that issue. This is kind of what started the ball rolling. And it was, okay, so you had the moral majority and then the Christian Coalition with Pat Robertson. And now that we have the internet and we have Fox News, Donald Trump basically took his playbook from Fox News. Fox News saw that when Fox News started, they weren't pandering to the evangelicals the first couple of years. In fact, Fox, even as a network, aired shows that evangelicals were appalled by. I remember one in particular called Son of the Beach. And like even some people didn't even like The Simpsons and some of the other Tracy Ullman show and other, that might have not been Fox. I'm trying to remember that. But anyway, some of the evangelicals weren't really big Fox supporters in the first couple years when they made their foray into television. But after a few years of reading the tea leaves, they could see that this is a constituency that they want to have control. They want to feel like they're getting their country back. And so that's been it all along. And they're just feeding everybody and feeding into all that anger And it's their fault. It's their fault. It's their fault that you're not in control. We got to take back our country. And so anyway, 70 years ago, evangelicals wouldn't even listen to somebody like Sean Hannity because he says because he identifies as Catholic. But now it's more about culture than it is anything else. Okay? It's about culture.
Well, and even the abortion issue was seen as a Catholic issue.
Yes.
Until Roe v. Wade.
Right. Exactly. And so the two most recent events, catalysts were the election of Obama. Okay. That's another symbolic thing that there's not going to be an evangelical white person in the White House. Okay. So it's not just evangelical, but somebody who's white. They can say it's not. I would dare say for a significant percentage of evangelicals, that is the case. It may not equate to blatant racism as much as it is we were here first kind of a thing. We brought you over and, you were mistreated and all that, but we're the ones who developed this superior form of Christianity. And then you joined us. I think there's because after all, a lot of these folks don't even consider Catholicism to be legitimately Christian. I don't know how they actually, if they even see Christian history as even mattering. They seem to have no concept of how their groups even, where they came from and how Christianity was started or anything. They're oblivious to this. It doesn't really matter. It's just a lot of people don't really know much about the history of this country, but they somehow think that as long as they can interpret the Constitution according to their liking, they'll do that. They'll interpret the Constitution and the Bible according to their liking, and it legitimizes them. And as far as I can see, that's where it's coming from.
So I agree with the majority of your point here, except for I don't think evangelicals were ever in charge. I don't think they were ever the largest constituency.
I think they perceived they were in charge. They
perceived themselves that way.
That's what I meant to say. But yes, I don't know, because let's put it this way. They had enough influence that a lot of these presidents pretended to be evangelical even when they weren't. Or they at least pretended to be supportive of evangelicals, even if they really secretly weren't.
Well, yeah, I mean, was Reagan actually an evangelical, or was he a mainline guy?
Reagan didn't even go to church, as far as I know.
Well, Reagan is the guy who made no-fault divorce legal in California.
Right.
It was a strategic move, not a ideological one.
I don't know that Reagan was any more religious than Trump is. Reagan never pretended to quote from the Bible or anything like Trump does, and that's what's kind of sad and funny about it at the same time, because Reagan was at least smart enough to not try to quote scripture, because he knew if he botched it, that these people would call him out on it. But now it's I don't know why. Whatever.
So here's my hot take for you.
But Reagan promised them Supreme Court justices to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Well, and part of it was Reagan is a staunch capitalist, which for some reason became an evangelical platform.
Well, yes. Boy, and that's multifaceted too.
Well, so here's my along with the capitalism of the evangelical movement, here's my hot take is that the concern with abortion, divorce, and LGBTQ issues, along with capitalism and the war against communism or any leftist ideology,
right.
I think those are disingenuous values that the evangelicals use religion to smoke screen their true meaning. That abortion is not a religious topic. Divorce is not a religious topic. LGBTQ things are not a religious topic. And capitalism is not a religious topic for evangelicals, but that they use the evangelical religion as a smokescreen for their true purposes. That's my hot take here. Because if you read the Bible, the Old Testament has a recipe for abortion. It says, if this and this and this happen and a woman gets pregnant, abort the baby. Okay, so the Bible can't be used to say abortion is wrong in every case.
Mm-hmm.
With divorce, the scripture is also in tension on divorce. LGBTQ, there are arguments for and against. Nothing is set in stone the way that the evangelicals portray it as. Even capitalism is obviously railed against by it's just the Book of Acts alone.
But go ahead. Did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
No, my point is that part of the anti-intellectualism of the evangelical movement is to say, no, the Bible is really clear on this. Christianity has always been really clear on these issues. Right. This is our tradition for forever, when it hasn't been. And that's actually a smokescreen for just a sort of far-right political agenda that is non-religious in nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and honestly, I think that's a lot of what, let's put it this way. I do think, like what you're saying about most issues. Okay. So let's say women being in positions of authority. Okay. That was a traditional one. So a lot of evangelicals traditionally were against, women having positions of authority, being pastors and such. But there were a lot of, some of the evangelical, well, let's put it this way, on the more, and I'm putting, say, like the holiness people on the Pentecostal side, okay, because of the emphasis of the baptism of the Holy Spirit and that kind of mysticism. And it was very mystical theology. On that side, yeah, I think a lot of those folks were okay with women being ordained and such, and because they were not really into the biblical literalism. And it was on the other side, the fundamentalist side. It was more like the Wesleyan, mainly Wesleyan influence groups and the Calvinist influence groups, or the two mainstreams. Well, the Wesleyan groups didn't really get involved in the other side. The Calvinist groups were more on that side. And they still don't allow, like the Baptists, they're still, whether women can still be called, they're still battling over whether women can even be called pastors, let alone be the head of a church. But anyway, there's something different about LGBTQ here. I think that they want these things to be controlled, but there's a number of them, like they still have enough doubt about it that if it affected them, they would probably be sympathetic to saying, oh, well, little Susie, Susie, she wants to be a pastor. Maybe she should be able to be a pastor. Okay. Or, little Susie's pregnant. Maybe be all right. God would understand if, because it would really mess up her life to go ahead and have this baby. Maybe if we get the abortion early, they're more likely to kind of overlook it. But I have not heard stories until the LGBTQ thing where people have actually thrown their own kids under the bus. Even some of these evangelicals, 20 years ago, whenever they had a son or daughter come out of the closet and they completely disowned them. And then the kid ends up committing suicide. There were a number of these cases. That's why, I don't know how to explain this phenomenon of why it's gone to this extent, except to say it's homophobia. I don't know what else it can be. This has now become the defining issue. I've never seen an issue in evangelicalism enforced as though it were some type of Spanish Inquisition. This people group has never been that way before. They are doing exactly some of the things that they condemned Catholics and other groups for doing for many, 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 many years. Let me say this. Here's the point. Even the evangelicals who were at least a little more open-minded about, say, something like evolution, okay? For some people, that would be a dividing line, and they would make that. And those harsher, fundamentalists, yes, they drew lines on other things too. But even some of the more tolerant of the evangelical groups now have become intolerant when it comes to this particular issue. I don't know how to explain it other than homophobia. And what I mean by this is they're willing to contextualize other passages of Scripture whenever they see some practical reason or some other consideration that should be taken into consideration. But when it comes to this issue, nope, all bets are off. It says it right there. It's sola scriptura. It's like the harshest form of fundamentalism. Not only that, but how dare you even say that this should be even open to interpretation or discussion. I would never have imagined to ever see something like this in my lifetime, at least.
I think part of what I was trying to get to by talking about like how the nuclear family is sort of the foundation of this type of culture is that when you affirm LGBTQ relationships theologically, I think there is an intuitive understanding amongst these homophobic evangelicals that when you affirm that, you desanctify the nuclear family as a sacrament, basically. And that when you desanctify the nuclear family, the rest of society falls to that. That the evangelicals have so far sanctified America, but when you desanctify the nuclear family, the rest of the society becomes desanctified as well, and you don't get to see it as God bless the USA. I think that is the root of this homophobia.
Yeah, you may be right. You may be right. I don't know. That would be something that'd be worth looking into. I mean, it's obvious that this is like a make or break issue. I'm not sure why people react to it, this particular issue, like more strongly than they've reacted to any other issue. I don't know. It may be something to do with the nuclear family. Maybe it has to do with gender roles. I don't know.
But even like the people who say like, oh, well, the genders are just different but equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is a nonsense take anyway. But those people are also homophobic. So
yeah.
I think it really is. It comes down to the affirmation of LGBTQ people is a tacit condemnation of the rest of society. And it's not even a condemnation. It's just a desanctification.
Mm-hmm.
It desacralizes our culture.
Well, in their minds, that's what it does in their minds.
It's a desacralization of Western culture. It's the opposite of Western exceptionalism.
Well,
I think that's the root, but that's my take, and that's a little speculative. So I'm open to critique on that.
Yeah. Well, I might want to do some digging into that, but that might be something we could look into. Yeah. So that'll be something we'll research here and maybe come back to here in upcoming weeks. What are their real objection? What are they really objecting to? Why are they objecting? And, what specifically is so bothersome to them? That'd be something that bears a little research and exploring.
Well, and it's the question of why does legalizing gay marriage ruin marriage for the rest of heterosexual society?
Right. Well, and
I have a hard time explaining it any other way.
Let's say this, okay? If it was just people fighting that their churches not be forced to have to change their doctrine, things like that, then I would support that. I mean, there needs to be freedom of religion, but it's not even that. They don't even want these things to be, even if the rest of society says we don't agree, and they can't point to anything, any kind of tangible harm that's being caused by these laws changing, what is it then, other than like an issue of who's controlling culture or influencing culture?
I think the evangelical tendency towards conversion theology was the fertile ground for this type of ideology, because what it functionally does at this point is make all ethics centered around whether you go to heaven or hell, whether you've been converted or not. And it's not really about this life in any way.
It may be, but I would venture to say a lot of this centers on the way they want to view the Bible. They don't want to view the Bible in its historical context. They want to view the Bible as though it transcends all context. And so we don't have the right to say, well, we don't think that way anymore.
I think they don't want to read the Bible at all, though. Like, that's what I'm saying is, like, this is sort of a smokescreen. Because, like, if you read the Bible, there's no case in the Bible for an anti-abortion stance.
No, that's true. That's true. I don't know.
Not when God literally commands Israelites to have abortions.
Well, you got to remember, American culture has even, had a long period of time where people were even, drug out of their bedrooms from privacy and then executed for sodomy and things like that. So this has very deep roots. And I don't think it's just limited to evangelicalism. It might be something that has more to do with American culture than it does actually Christianity or even evangelicalism.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's pretty much the case I'm trying to make, is that LGBTQ challenges the sanctity of our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, our next episode, we will come back and we'll look at the beliefs, evangelical beliefs, and frame those for you, and then get into how those beliefs have been developed, changed, challenged, defended, and how that's kind of playing out today, and the different kind of polarizations that exist. So, any other loose ends we need to tie up here that we can't tie up tomorrow?
I don't think so. I think I've gnawed this bone pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, I think we have too. I don't think we've left much for the dog to clean up on. So anyway, we appreciate your time and hope this has been helpful. We welcome any feedback you want to give us. Email us at thehappycynics@gmail.com. And if the world doesn't end beforehand, we will be back. Take care.